What happens when one of the most globally recognized women in entertainment sits across from one of the most outspoken voices on daytime television, and neither one of them is willing to back down? That is exactly what you are about to find out, because what unfolded on that stage was not your average celebrity interview. It was a collision of two completely different worlds, two completely different value systems, and two women who were each absolutely convinced they were right. And the audience, they had no idea what they were walking into. Before we get into it, if you are new here, subscribe right now, because this channel is where we break down the moments that television tried to move past too quickly. And drop a comment below. We want to know whose side you are on before you even finish watching. Now let us get into it. Priyanka Chopra Jonas had come onto The View as a guest who needed no real introduction. A former Miss World, a Bollywood icon, a Hollywood crossover success, a producer, an author, and a global ambassador for causes ranging from children's rights to gender equality. She had done the press circuit enough times to know how these things usually go. A few warm questions, some applause lines, a moment to plug whatever project she was there to promote, and then a clean exit. Comfortable, controlled, professional. But Joy Behar had other plans. The tension did not arrive with a bang. It crept in slowly, the way it always does when two people are being polite on the surface while something else is simmering underneath. The show opened the way it usually does, with the host already mid-conversation, trading jokes, setting the tone. The audience was warm, the energy in the room was light, and then Priyanka walked out, and the applause was genuinely enthusiastic, the kind that tells you the crowd already liked her before she said a single word. She sat down, smiled that smile that has graced magazine covers on 6 continents, and the interview began. The first few minutes were exactly what you would expect. Whoopi Goldberg leaned in with genuine curiosity, asking about her production work, the stories she was choosing to tell, the way she was navigating Hollywood as a South Asian woman in an industry that had spent decades pretending South Asian women did not exist. Priyanka was sharp. She was articulate. She spoke with the kind of quiet confidence that comes not from arrogance but from having actually done the work and having the receipts to prove it. She talked about the intentionality behind the projects she chose to produce. She talked about how representation was not just a talking point for her. It was a business decision, a cultural responsibility, and a personal mission all wrapped into one. The audience was nodding. The hosts were engaged. It felt like it was going well, and then Joy spoke. Now, to understand what happened next, you have to understand something about Joy Behar. She has been on that panel for a long time, long enough to have developed a very particular style of engagement that her fans call fearless and her critics call reckless. She does not ask questions so much as she lobs them. There is always an angle. There is always a point she is trying to make, and sometimes the guest is less of a conversation partner and more of a vehicle for Joy to arrive at the conclusion she already had before. The cameras turned on. Her first question to Priyanka seemed innocent enough on its face. She asked, with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, whether Priyanka felt that the kind of visibility she was advocating for was sometimes used as a distraction from deeper, more systemic issues. Whether, in other words, putting brown faces in previously white spaces was being used by studios and corporations as a substitute for actual structural change. It was, on paper, a legitimate question, the kind of question a thoughtful journalist might ask. The problem was not the question itself. The problem was the way it was asked, with a slightly condescending tilt, as though Joy already knew the answer and was simply waiting for Priyanka to catch up. Priyanka caught it immediately. She paused for just a moment, the kind of pause that in television terms lasts approximately one lifetime. And then she smiled and said, "That was a really interesting framing." But she wanted to push back on the premise a little bit, because she did not think visibility and structural change were mutually exclusive, and she found it a little bit curious that the question of whether representation was real progress seemed to get asked most loudly whenever the people gaining visibility were not from the groups that had historically held the power. The audience reacted, not loudly, but you could feel it, that slight collective intake of breath that happens when someone on a talk show panel says something that was not on the script. Joy's smile stayed in place, but something shifted behind it. She pressed further. She said she was not dismissing representation. She was raising a question about whether people like Priyanka, people who had achieved enormous personal success within existing systems, were perhaps the wrong messengers for a conversation about dismantling those systems. Whether success within a structure made it harder to honestly critique that structure, and this is where it started to get genuinely uncomfortable, because what Joy was doing, and the audience could feel it even if they could not quite articulate it, was subtle but pointed. She was using the language of progressive critique to suggest that Priyanka's success was somehow disqualifying, that having made it, having broken through, having built something, meant that Priyanka could no longer speak credibly about the barriers that existed. It was a trap disguised as a philosophical question, and it was the kind of trap that tends to work on guests who are either unprepared or who are too eager to be liked to call it out directly. Priyanka was neither of those things. She leaned forward slightly. She kept her voice completely even, and she said, with a precision that made it clear she had thought about this long before this conversation, that she found it fascinating how the standard of credibility seemed to shift depending on who was in the room. She pointed out that nobody asked successful white executives whether their personal achievement disqualified them from advocating for systemic change in their industries. She said the idea that a person had to remain disadvantaged in order to remain a credible voice for others who were disadvantaged was one of the more quietly damaging ideas in public discourse, because what it ultimately said to people who were trying to climb was that the price of success was silence. The room went very quiet. Whoopi, to her credit, gave a single slow nod, the kind that says I am not getting involved, but I see exactly what just had happened. Joy opened her mouth to respond, and this is where the conversation went somewhere that nobody, not the producers, not the other hosts, not the audience, and quite possibly not even Priyanka herself, was fully prepared for, because Joy did not back down. She doubled down, and in doing so, she walked the conversation into territory that moved it from a debate about representation into something far more personal, far more charged, and far more revealing about the assumptions that were sitting just beneath the surface of everything that had been said so far. She brought up Priyanka's marriage. Now, on the surface, it was framed as a cultural observation, Joy said, with the kind of casual delivery that is designed to make something pointed sound like small talk, that she had always been curious about the dynamic of a woman who spoke so passionately about female autonomy and self-determination, and yet had chosen to marry someone so much younger than herself. She said she meant it as a genuine question, not a criticism. She said she just wondered whether Priyanka had ever felt any tension between the image she projected publicly and the choices she made privately. The audience shifted. You could hear it, that low, uncomfortable murmur that a live television crowd makes when they sense that something has crossed a line, but they are not entirely sure yet how to respond to it. Priyanka did not flinch, not visibly, but if you watched her closely, and this is the kind of moment that rewards close watching, you could see something move through her eyes. Not hurt, not anger, exactly. Something more like recognition, like she had seen this move before, executed by different people in different rooms, and she had long since decided exactly how she was going to handle it every single time. She looked at Joy directly and said she wanted to make sure she understood the question correctly. She said, was Joy asking whether the age gap in her marriage was somehow in contradiction with her values? Because, if that was the question, she was happy to answer it. But she also wanted to name what was actually happening in that question, which was the very old and very tired idea that a woman's personal relationship choices were fair game for public audit in a way that a man's never were. Joy started to interject. Priyanka kept going, not loudly, not with the kind of raised voice that signals you are losing. She kept the same measured, almost conversational tone she had been using since she sat down, and she said that, in her experience, nobody sat across from a male executive or a male filmmaker or a male advocate and asked whether the age gap in his relationship undermined the credibility of his public work. She said that particular question, the one that dressed personal scrutiny up as feminist concern, was almost exclusively reserved for women who had dared to be successful enough that people felt entitled to look for the catch. Joy said that was not what she was doing. Priyanka said, very calmly, that she understood Joy, believed that, but she asked Joy to consider how the question landed, regardless of the intention behind it. She said intent and impact were two different things, and she had spent enough of her career on the receiving end of that particular gap to be very clear about what it felt like from the inside. The other hosts were doing the thing that hosts do when a conversation goes somewhere unexpectedly real. They were watching carefully, keeping their expressions neutral, waiting to see whether this was going to resolve itself or whether it was going to become the kind of moment that gets played on a loop for the next 72 hours. Sarah Ann tried to gently redirect. She offered Priyanka a softer follow-up, something about her production company and the kinds of female lead stories she was developing. It was a lifeline, clearly intentional, the kind of pivot that saves everyone from having to sit in discomfort any longer than necessary. Priyanka took the question. She answered it. She spoke about the projects she was building, the writers she was championing, the stories she believed deserved to be told, and she was genuinely compelling on all of it. But Joy was not done. There is a particular kind of conversational persistence that Joy Behar has turned into something of an art form over the years. She does not let things go. She circles back. She waits for the moment when the room has relaxed slightly, when the temperature has come down just enough that people have lowered their guard, and then she returns to the thread she was pulling on before. It is a technique. Whether it is always a wise technique is a separate question, but it is undeniably a technique. She waited until Priyanka had finished talking about her production work, let a beat pass, and then said that she wanted to go back to something, because she did not think the question had been fully answered, and she thought the audience deserved a real conversation rather than a polished one. She said she was not trying to attack Priyanka's marriage. She said what she was actually getting at was something she found genuinely interesting about Priyanka as a public figure, which was this quality she seemed to have of presenting herself as someone who had navigated the world entirely on her own terms. And Joy was curious whether that narrative was entirely honest, whether the access and the platform and the resources that came with Priyanka's marriage to someone embedded in one of the most powerful entertainment families in the world had perhaps made her path easier in ways she did not always acknowledge. And there it was, the thing underneath the thing. The real question that had been circling the conversation since Joy first opened her mouth. It was not really about the age gap. It was about whether Priyanka's success was genuinely self-made, or whether parts of it had been structurally assisted in ways that complicated the narrative she told about herself. It was a question about authenticity, and it was phrased in a way that was designed to be very difficult to answer without either sounding defensive or conceding ground that Priyanka clearly had no intention of conceding. Priyanka let the question sit in the air for a moment, then she said something that reframed the entire conversation in a way nobody on that panel had quite anticipated. She said she was glad Joy had made that point explicit, because it actually connected directly back to what they had been talking about earlier, the question of who gets to be a credible voice and under what circumstances. She said it was fascinating to her that the existence of a supportive partner was being positioned as something that complicated her narrative, because she was fairly certain that no equivalent conversation was being had about male entertainers and executives whose careers had been quietly supported, socially and professionally and financially, by the families and institutions and networks they were born into or married into. She said the expectation that a woman had to have clawed her way to success in total isolation, with no safety net and no support and no advantage of any kind, in order for that success to count as real, was not a progressive standard. It was an exhausting and selectively applied one. She said she was proud of her marriage. She said she was also proud of her work. And she said she did not think she owed anyone a performance of suffering in order to make her achievements feel legitimate to people who were looking for a reason to minimize them. The audience applauded. Genuinely, not politely. Joy looked at her for a moment and then said, with a tone that was hard to read, that she respected the answer but she was not sure she agreed with it. Priyanka said that was completely fine. She said she was not there to be agreed with. And that, right there, is where the conversation cracked open into something neither of them had planned on. Because Joy, perhaps stung by the response, perhaps genuinely provoked by the confidence of it, said something that moved the conversation out of the realm of debate and into the realm of something far more raw. She said she sometimes wondered whether people who had grown up in cultures with more rigid social structures around gender had a different relationship to the idea of personal autonomy than people who had grown up in the West. She said she meant it as an observation, not an insult. She said she was curious whether some of what Priyanka described as her own chosen path had been shaped by frameworks she had absorbed so early in life that she might not even recognize them as frameworks. The room went very, very still, because what Joy had just done, whatever her intention, was tell a woman who had spent decades navigating the specific and often invisible condescension that the Western entertainment industry reserves for people who come from somewhere else, that her sense of her own autonomy might not be entirely reliable, that maybe she did not fully understand herself, that maybe someone from a different background was better placed to identify the invisible strings attached to her choices. Priyanka looked at her, and then she smiled. Not warmly, precisely. She said she appreciated the curiosity, and then she said she wanted to offer Joy something in return, which was her own observation. She said that in her experience, the assumption that women from non-Western cultures needed to be gently guided toward a more enlightened understanding of their own freedom was one of the most persistent and least examined blind spots in Western progressive thought. She said it dressed itself up as concern, but it functioned as condescension. And she said she had sat across from that particular brand of condescension enough times on enough continents to know it by its first name. She said, without raising her voice by a single degree, that she had not come onto the show to be assessed. She had come to have a conversation, and she was still happy to have that conversation, but she wanted it to be an honest one, between two people who were treating each other as equals, rather than one person treating the other as a case study. The silence that followed that was the loudest silence the show had produced in a very long time, and Joy, for the first time in the entire interview, did not have an immediate response. And Joy, for the first time in the entire interview, did not have an immediate response. What filled that silence was something the audience had not quite been prepared for, because this was not the silence of awkwardness, it was the silence of a room that had just watched a guest on a talk show refuse, with complete composure and zero aggression, to be talked down to, and not just refuse it, but name it, explain it, and turn it back around with a precision that made it impossible to dismiss. Whoopi finally spoke. She said, slowly, and with the particular weight she brings to moments when she decides to weigh in, that she thought Priyanka had just made one of the more important points she had heard on that stage in a while. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Joy shifted. Then she said she thought she might have phrased some of her questions poorly. Not that she was wrong, not that she had overstepped, that the phrasing might not have been ideal, which is the formulation people use when they want the credit of an apology without the admission that one was actually owed. Priyanka received it graciously. She said she appreciated that, without a trace of sarcasm, which somehow made it land harder than sarcasm would have. She said she did not think Joy was a bad person for asking what she had asked. She said those questions came from assumptions that were extremely common and largely unexamined, and the reason she had pushed back so directly was because she respected the platform enough to have an honest conversation rather than a comfortable one. Sunny Hostin leaned in and asked the question that cut to the center of everything. She asked how Priyanka managed to keep showing up to these conversations, the ones loaded with assumptions and uneven scrutiny, without either burning out or becoming so guarded that the conversations stopped being real. Priyanka paused, and this pause felt different from the earlier ones. Less tactical, more personal. She said the honest answer was that she had not always managed it well, that there had been stretches of her career, particularly in the early years in Hollywood, when the accumulation of small dismissals and large assumptions had genuinely worn her down, when she had softened things that should not have been softened and smiled through things that deserved a more direct response. She said what changed was not that the world got easier, it was that she got clearer about what she believed, clearer about what she would accept, and clearer about the difference between a conversation that was genuinely trying to understand her and one that was performing curiosity while delivering judgment. She said once she could tell the difference reliably, it became a lot easier to respond to each accordingly. The audience responded with the kind of sustained applause that is not about agreeing with a specific point but about recognition. The feeling of watching someone say something true. Joy, who had been quiet for several minutes, said something then that was the most unguarded thing she had offered all morning. She said she thought she had walked into this conversation carrying more assumptions than she had realized. She said that was worth sitting with. Priyanka looked at her and said that was the most interesting thing Joy had said all day. And something shifted after that, not dramatically, not with a sudden warmth that erased everything that had come before, but with the particular texture of two people who had genuinely pushed against each other and arrived, if not at agreement, at something more valuable. The acknowledgement that the other person was not going to collapse under pressure, and was not going to pretend the pressure had not been applied. Because what Priyanka Chopra Jonas walked into that room and demonstrated, without announcing it, was that it is possible to be challenged on your personal choices, your cultural background, and your entire narrative in front of a live audience, and to meet every single one of those challenges without crumbling, without overcorrecting, and without ever losing the thread of what you actually came to say. In a media landscape built on the assumption that people will either fold under pressure or explode under it, watching someone simply hold their ground with intelligence and precision is, genuinely, its own kind of spectacle. So here is the question we are leaving you with, and we want your answer in the comments right now. Do you think Joy Behar crossed a line, or do you think the discomfort she created was exactly the kind of discomfort that makes for a meaningful conversation? Drop your thoughts below. We read everything. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. Because this channel is where we break down the moments that matter, and there are plenty more where this one came from.